diversity and inclusion in humanitarian action. We recently have supported work with the World Blind Union on their COVID report called Amplifying Voices, Our Lives, Our Say. And this is a piece of work that provides key learnings from COVID through the experiences of blind and partially sighted persons across the world. And of course, we also have the VIVID project, which is all about building capacity of organizations that deploy volunteer to ensure disability inclusion across their practices. It's involved in promoting deinstitutionalization practices and also promoting an assessment process where each organization can identify areas they need to build up on accessibility standards and leave no one behind. And that's a key point. We've actually learned a lot from that process. Perhaps then just to share some learnings from COVID and our new ways of working. Two things that have kind of been raised here. One is work we were doing on designing a project and putting together a funding proposal in Indonesia. So the whole project was designed online with local partners, our country office team, local OPDs. And because we weren't able to be there in person, it kind of made us think a bit more about the whole approach. So a key decision was made that this time we would run those project development workshops in local language in Indonesia. And then all of our team were participating with translation. So there was translation services for English speakers. So this shifted the dynamic completely of how, and shifted the power completely. And it really raised local engagement and buy-in substantially. It was hard for our team to work through translation, but it really we learned a lot about how what our local stakeholders have to go through and how much we expect from them. Another shift I have seen is the increased participation of the Global South voice in meetings and events. With developments in technology, it is somewhat easier. Things aren't always as advanced as we would like, but it's easier to bring in partners to conversations and have them lead them as well. We don't need people physically in the room, and these events can now be accessible to all, much like here today. Previously, we would have weighed up the costs to fly people in. We would have had those nightmare scenarios around visa approvals, which I'm sure you've all gone through. But COVID has actually taken all that away and shown what is possible. For CBM, even as a lead organization on inclusion, we are still striving to be better. And certainly I think COVID has forced us all to take a step back and examine our role and place in international development programming and humanitarian action. So based on new virtual working modalities, we can now see that many barriers people with disabilities face, particularly in the areas of accessibility, they are there, and a commitment to inclusion from organizations needs to be made. I will finish now and just leave you with some questions that I think we all need to ask ourselves about the future of international volunteering and how it can be more effective and inclusive. So there's questions around, should we be sending volunteers from the global north to countries where they can develop their own skills, provide assistance and then leave? Or should we be looking more to local communities to recruit our volunteers? Should we abandon our volunteers from the global north and say no more and then lose the benefit of their skills and experience? And isn't it time to stop thinking of a person with a disability that they can never be as valuable as an able-bodied volunteer? And should we also now invest on the ground in inclusive disaster risk reduction and preparedness programs to build local capacity and for more immediate and sustainable emergency response? Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Jimmy, thanks. I'll ring you later. I'm after getting into it.
Okay.
All right.
Brian, can I ask you to go on mute, Brian, please? Yeah,
okay,
thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Shane.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. Apologies for the technology. We're just talking about technology, and there it goes. So it's not a full safe by any stretch of the imagination. But Great. I'm going to introduce the panel now. The panel is made up of Seamus O'Leary. Seamus is the project funding manager for Mission Cara in Ireland. And Seamus has been involved in overseas development work for many years. And he previously worked in Romania and Albania with a Wexford-based charity providing support to the missionaries of charity care centres in Eastern Europe. And Seamus spent 3 years with the Columban Lay Missionary Program in Lahore in Pakistan. And we've got Victor Okonga. Victor is a former volunteer for VC, I suppose. He is an in-country development manager for the FMSJ Sisters. And he has been working on health and education projects in the rural areas in Kenya and Uganda. And before joining FMSJ, Victor spent over 13 years with the Jesuits in Kenya. Then we've got Ria Kotinen, and she is the program coordinator for the Abelis Foundation in Finland. And she is also part of this, the Vivid Consortium member. She has a long experience in project management, monitoring and evaluation of projects. And Abelis Foundation supports organizations of persons with disability in the Global South. And Rhea herself is responsible for Vietnam and Myanmar. Colette Rooney, our own Colette Rooney. She is the recruitment manager and the EU project manager for the VC in Ireland. So Colette has been involved in the recruitment and deployment of volunteers since 2005. And prior to that, she was involved in the corporate and consultancy sectors. So that's a quick rundown, abbreviated version, because I'm conscious of time. And I'm conscious I'm speaking very fast. Apologies about that. It's just one of these things when you're worried about time. Okay, so Sarah left lots of questions. I didn't have time to write them all down. But I think the main, one of the key elements that she did mention was this area of localization, and you know, this idea whether we should be, how we as volunteering agencies, or how we should be supporting, what's the best way of supporting projects in the future. She spoke of localization. And how that might affect the recruitment and deployment of volunteers. So I'm just going to hand that over as a question, maybe to Seamus. Maybe Seamus, you might like to talk a little bit about your understanding of that whole aspect of localization as a potential, or what way we should be dealing with it.
Thanks, Shane. Better remember to unmute first. I can just share a few thoughts. Important question. I'm not sure or even collectively we can come up with all the answers. I'd agree with some of the points Sarah made in terms of the importance of people driving their own development trajectories. And a bit like CBM, as you know, in Mission Cara, we believe very strongly in that principle of subsidiarity, where as much as possible, the initiatives are designed by those whose lives the initiatives are designed to touch. The language around this is difficult. 2 points come to mind. I suppose we're all about transforming lives. We're all about trying to create situations where people can live out their own potential. Or to quote, I often like to quote Amartya Sen, the Indian economist. He defines development as freedom. So freedom to live the kind of lives we value. So with that in mind, putting language on what development means becomes challenging. Putting language on what transformation means becomes challenging. But I think an important point to note is that if we see ourselves as having some sort of a role in helping with transformation, it's key that we ourselves are open to being transformed. And I think Sarah made some points in that regard, with regard to, you know, bringing people with different forms of abilities into the center, subverting the conversation by doing it in a different language. The second point I'd make is that I don't think we should be overly romantic about the idea of localization when it comes to volunteering or sending volunteers. I think it is important to recognize that a lot of the issues that we face are global issues. If COVID has done nothing else, it shows just how interconnected we all are. Many of the big challenges facing us in relation to biodiversity and climate change are global issues. Many of the injustices that we try to tackle are driven as much by global dynamics as they are by national, regional, national, or local dynamics. And with that in mind, I think as a sector, or as organizations that are trying to contribute to this transformation, we need to be careful not to lose sight of the value of having people involved in those initiatives that can think through different perspectives, that can think through different knowledge systems. And you can only think your way through different knowledge systems, I think, if you have immersed yourself in those knowledge systems. Things get lost in translation. The more languages you learn, the more you begin to appreciate just what that means. And I think there is a value in people immersing themselves in an experience that allows them to see the world in a different way. Which brings me back to my first point. So long as those that are volunteering across these boundaries, whatever those boundaries might be, we're talking now maybe about national boundaries, but there are many types of boundaries to do with abilities, to do with socioeconomic status, to do with gender, all sorts of boundaries. So long as those that are seeking to cross those boundaries are open to being transformed themselves and are not crossing those boundaries with a notion that they have a way, they have the answers. Certainly they can offer a particular perspective, but they need to be open to the perspectives themselves. The third point, which I'll make very briefly, is this whole notion of solidarity and the power of presence. You mentioned I've volunteered in different countries when I got initially involved in this sector in Eastern Europe and in Asia. And presence does mean something. It depends on, I suppose, how you represent yourself, but there is a power in that gesture of leaving your own safety net and trying to find a way of exploring options to make this world a better place for all of us, with people who maybe don't have some of the dividends or the benefits that might accrue to those of us in this part of the world, for example, simply because of where we're born. So I think there is a powerful, that has a powerful impact, that power of presence on people. Hopefully it also, again, reciprocates that the presence of those with whom we engage in turn influences us. There are three quick thoughts, Shane.
Great. Thanks very much, Seamus. Maybe we could go over to Victor, because Victor is in field and he knows pretty much, he would have a very good understanding of localization and how it might affect him from the perspective of whether we should be sending volunteers in or whether we need to complement volunteers. What do you think, Victor?
Thank you, Shane. And I would very much agree with Seamus and the thoughts about localization. And definitely one thing that I would really agree with is the idea of romanticizing localization. It is a good thing, and it's going to offer some, potentials in terms of how we do development, in the sense that it's possibly going to tap into the local pool of knowledge that is there, and help with the movement, because as a local person volunteering in a local organization, there's that understanding of the local environment very well. And in most cases, that helps in shortening the time of integration into an organization. And you know your way around things, and you can facilitate certain things in a better way, as opposed to maybe somebody who comes from a little bit far away. The deployment also is easy in the sense that the person has a local knowledge of the local environment. They don't have to be bound by certain rules and statutory requirements, and that makes the process easier. But again, I think there are elements that we have to think about. We have to think about, what about the skill sets that are not locally available? How are we going to benefit from those skill sets? Should there be a link between maybe a local volunteer with other maybe non-local volunteers who have that skills? So that, because at the end of the day, also the local volunteers might need to be upskilled in certain areas. So I think that's one big element that we have to think about. And then I think if we look at localization as the only option that we might, as a replacement to all other forms of volunteerism, then we may lose the opportunity that comes with, non-local volunteerism. And I'm thinking of issues of, in the environments that we work in, we benefit a lot from intercultural exchanges. That would be very important, especially in, bringing about behavior change, for example, or providing a counter narrative in the ways that we've viewed and we've done things over the years. And that, in essence, is part of development in itself. And then the integration of values in our society, because we know that we benefit a lot through that integration. And if we just look at localization as the only option, then we might lose out on some of these things. But it's a great thing. It puts maybe a lot of weight on the local also as agencies of that change in development, which is a great thing. But I think, in my opinion, it should be integrated, and we need to look at maybe different sides of localization. Thank you, Shane.
Thanks, Victor. Sarah, just in terms of your take on localization, could you not envisage it being seen as another sort of buzzword trend, or something that we just pay lip service to? Because is it not true that we need to that these countries need to be playing their part in a globalized world, a globalized economy, with all that entails, or that it doesn't become some form of protectionism, perhaps, that that we're keeping the Kenyans to the Kenyans, for example, or how do you see it?
Oh, good question. I see it. I mean, the word localization is bandied about quite a bit. We see some big donor agencies talking about the real importance of localization, their commitments to it, and then in reality, we don't really see it holding true. I mean, for us, localization is about inclusion, and it's about this whole piece of nothing about us without us, so for us, from the perspective of ensuring we're protecting the rights of people with disabilities, part of that is for them to realize their own future. So that's really why we engage with the disability movement. I think that in terms of when we're talking about volunteering, for localization, there obviously are gaps in capacity that need to be supported. But I think for long-term sustainability of the work that volunteers do, it has to be where we're building that local capacity to respond in times of humanitarian crisis. I spent time in Haiti straight after the earthquake 10 years ago now. I can't believe it's that long ago. And at the time I was there were 100,000 aid workers in Haiti. And obviously many of them were needed because all structures and systems were broken. Many hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, and there was a need for that emergency response. So, but 6 months in, 9 months in, most of those people were gone. And so that was the immediate impact of their presence there, but the long-term impact wasn't really there. So it's about the sustainability of what we're doing, I think. So we need to address both of those. There's certainly value in volunteers going to countries, immersing themselves. We know good intentions that people have when they volunteer, and I know as a volunteer myself in the past, where what I've gotten back from it has really enriched and transformed my life. So we can't just negate that and just say localization is the way forward and that's it. We have to build systems to help that happen. So I hope to kind of address those questions, Shane.
Thanks. Yeah. I would be interested now to hear a little bit about the disability element, particularly whether online volunteering specifically for disability, and maybe I'll come to Ray on this, whether it has, whether it is a practical opportunity for people with disability, or is it something that is, looks okay on paper, but may never actually be achieved. What's your feeling on that, Ray?
Thanks, Shane. I definitely think that online volunteering gives possibilities. It opens doors for many people that probably are not there yet. However, I think we need to be mindful that this would not be the only possibility, for example, for persons with disabilities. I could easily see it going the way that, okay, a person with a disability challenges going to a certain country, let's offer them online volunteering, and that would be the only thing that they would then ever get to do. So I think once again keeping options open, and also then coming back to accessibility. So we really need to make sure that when things are being done online, that they are really accessible for everyone. So even within Abilis Foundation, which is an organization of persons with disabilities, we have found out during COVID that it's not so easy to be fully accessible. We think that we are, but now that we are actually conducting everything online, it has brought us closer. For example, when we are now in Finland, we are now in the process of planning for the next 4-year program, because we get funding from the ministry and that's the way things go. So we are now actually planning our next 4-year program closely, of course, with our country offices, and then hearing the voice from the grassroots level persons with disabilities. And I can see that the Abilis team, now thinking largely the global team, so our country offices included, has become a lot closer, and the kind of feeling of trust and belonging to the same organization has grown, because we are now connecting actually more often, because before we would rely more on the face-to-face meetings when we go on monitoring trips, and then we go to the offices and then we discuss things together. So definitely this time online has opened new possibilities. But yes, I think accessibility being one very big issue. We're still struggling with which is the best tool for online meetings. Is it Zoom, is it Teams, or what? And we kind of, well, I guess Zoom at the moment, but all these different programs have their own challenges. So I don't think anything is perfectly accessible yet. And then secondly, I would really want to make sure that there are possibilities, or different kinds of possibilities for volunteering, so not just online.
Right. Thanks, Rhea. Colette, are you still with us?
Shane?
Yeah, I'd be quite interested to hear your take on what you think about disability inclusion in online volunteering, but also people like previously disadvantaged people, those that have been, I suppose, excluded from volunteering, perhaps older people, unemployed, you know, migrants, refugees, all of that area. What's your take on all of that? Do you think it's a runner?
Yes, first of all, just apologies for the background noise here. I'm also admitting people from the waiting room into the meeting, so if you hear some beeping, that's what the noise is on myself and Shane's feed there. That's a very complex question, Shane, to do it from, and I can only speak from my perspective as somebody who you know, goes out to find volunteers, recruits volunteers, organises them for their overseas assignments and supports them while they're overseas. I suppose in terms of the type of volunteering that we do, it's completely needs-based. We only deploy volunteers where there's a definite need, a skills gap that has been identified by our partner. So the need is driven from the field. You know, there's nobody local with that skill set. It could be something in, you know, financial accounting. It could be something like physiotherapy. It might be something around project management. And we will go out and recruit a volunteer. And we will create a professional role description around that. We will conduct an interview process. We will bring them on our training program. And what you find is that you're not going to get responses from people outside a certain socioeconomic background. You're not going to get responses from people with disabilities. You're not going to get responses from the African diaspora. In the last number of years in Ireland, we find that the amount of people who are interested in long-term commitments, that's the type of volunteering that we would promote, and that would be 6 months to 1 year, 1 year plus in some situations, particularly if it's a multi-annual funded project. We'd be looking for somebody for a longer-term commitment. The numbers of people who are interested in that type of volunteering has greatly diminished. That's a global trend that we are all experiencing. And that has affected the volunteering up until the COVID, the global pandemic. That has, you know, been an emerging trend and has affected all of the volunteering agencies based in Ireland. So that's the background that we're working against. So we have been recruiting volunteers from wherever they're coming from. They could be, you know, an Argentinian physio who wants to go to Haiti, a Brazilian human rights lawyer who wants to work in Uganda in a refugee camp. So we will meet the need of the partners first and foremost, but generally that will exclude, not by anything that we set out to do, because we have an open recruitment policy, we adhere to all best practices in that area, that will exclude a lot of people because we are responding at a professional level to the needs of the partners, and we're meeting those as best we can. So that's where we find ourselves. So how do you address that? Do we, you know, we have to create awareness, and we have to unlearn, and we have to work differently with partners. And I suppose online volunteering can help us achieve that, particularly if you are working with somebody here in Ireland, somebody who might be somebody very highly skilled back in their own home country, but now finds themselves in a, you know, as an asylum seeker in Ireland in a direct provision centre. And that person has very specific skills. They've come from a background that, you know, I think that's given them a lot of life skills as well, but they actually can't volunteer. They can't come and join our training program because you need to have money in your back pocket to be a volunteer. They can't fly, they can't leave the country, they don't have visas. They can, you know, they're very limited what they can do here. And likewise with other groups in Ireland, we certainly don't attract anybody from the travelling community who maybe have great community development skills and experience and could be of benefit in a similar setting. We also, you know, attract very little people with disabilities. So how do we change that? I think we have to go back to the drawing board, and we have to see how that might work and what kind of supports. And this is for physical deployment now, this is not for online volunteering, to see how that person might be supported going into the field, particularly if they have any kind of extra needs. And if they need an assistant, if they need special you know, assistance when traveling and all of those kind of areas, that we actually have the funding to support that person, but also that we need to, you know, move away from what we've traditionally known as well. And that's not something that's going to happen immediately. It's something that we need to work on ourselves and with our partners. So that's from my own perspective, as somebody who recruits volunteers, and that's the honest truth, that we just don't get people from those groupings that we've discussed here. Online volunteering will level the playing field, but as I mentioned earlier, I think we have to move away from the idea of online volunteering as somebody who's going to sit down in front of a computer and spend 8 hours doing a piece of work. We have to look differently at how relationships can be built, how the skills share can happen. And it's not going to be the way that we're used to. We're going to have to find new ways to do that. And the only way we can do that is trial and pilot and get people from those different socioeconomic backgrounds, people with disabilities, get those people involved. How we reach them, that's up to us, and you know, our approach.
Great. There's lots of stuff there that we could talk all day around, Colette. You know, you're touching on things like needs-based development, and where does needs-based development fit? You know, in terms of the pecking order for inclusion. You know, if someone is looking for a capacity building in the area of financial accounts or whatever it might be, you know, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to engage in terms of recruitment. You know, what is the incentive for the sending organizations in the first instance to look at those areas? Or do we need separate programming? Do we need inclusive empowerment programming, which is I think is what we're saying here, because it's definitely it's an affordability issue. It's not going to be the cheapest option to use people in fulfill deployment programs where you have others that are not going to cost as much. I mean, that's the basic, that's the element of it. Rhea mentioned about accessibility, and you know, I suppose we've gone through at VC now, and that since the Vivid project, we've gone through quite a huge learning curve, and me in particular. You know, we thought we were relatively good at this area, but I'm glad to hear that you've also had challenges, Rhea, and you are a disability organisation in promotion of disability and awareness. So I'm glad that we're not on our own on that journey. It has been an amazing experience to go to talk to individuals within the Vivid program and consortium about how to connect with this huge cohort. I mean, Sarah, maybe you have the statistics to hand as to what level of disability are we dealing with in the world today? You know, what sort of numbers are we looking at?
So we know the statistics, you will see that 1 in 7 people in the world live with a disability, have lived experience of disability. That's 1 billion people. And we know about 80% of them are living in the developing countries. So that's 800 million women, men, and children. So it's the biggest minority, I think, in the world. So yeah, it's significant. Just to reflect on some of the points there, if I can, Shane. I mean,
sure.
I think the key going forward is I think we need to start with looking at ourselves. I think we need to ensure that our own organizations are inclusive. We need to make sure everyone is in the room for those discussions. So when planning is happening, when we're reviewing how our approach, we need to look around and see who's not in this room. Where is the voice? Are all voices being heard here? And I think there are simple ways that people can start changing how we do things. There's been an expression I've heard all through COVID is around building back better. And like many things, it's, you know, leave no one behind, furthest behind first. They're easy phrases to roll off the tongue, but action will speak louder than words. So we don't want to lose the value of volunteering. Certainly Ireland's presence in the world has been, you know, Our whole reputation has for overseas development has been all through volunteering in the past with our missionaries, etc. And we don't want to lose the value of what we've given back. But we do now to take organizations need to take action now. This is the opportunity. The global pandemic has been a tragedy for a lot of people in their lives, will continue to be a tragedy for a lot of people and be very hard hitting personally for people. But it's also that opportunity. With disaster comes opportunity. So we need to take hold of that, and just to say, open your doors to people and start piloting things, start testing things. I had mentioned that piece around local, designing programs, local language. It was a very simple thing to do, and it's transformed how we think about things. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Sarah. There's just, I'm conscious that there's a collected audience, so I want to bring some comments and questions from the chat box. A comment from Rose. Thank you very much, Seamus, for this aspect. Appreciating the situation on the ground and the openness to be transformed too is very important in this process. A comment by Pat. Thank you, Seamus, for your reflections. From the Cambodian viewpoint, there is value in the power of presence and solidarity. There is a role for professional volunteers sharing skills, building up communities and capacities of national NGOs. Also, there are requirements from donors. Question from here from Rita: how to meet the challenge of, or how do you meet the challenge of understanding the wider community context the organization is working within through volunteering online? So how do you meet the challenge of understanding the wider community? I think you touched a little bit on that. Seamus, you touched a little bit on that. How do you get in a feel for the wider dynamics if you're only kept on an online feed? What do you think about that? Seamus, you're on mute there, sorry.
Well, that's tricky if you're online, because what I was talking about earlier was immersion. But before I digress, I suppose one of the benefits now of online is that we have some sort of audio-visual connection, which is more possible. And I certainly know from a personal point of view, when I left Pakistan in 2001, it was very difficult to stay connected to close friends, because it was €2 a minute to phone Pakistan, and they couldn't read or write. My writing in the Persian script was slow enough, but then they wouldn't be able to read it when I sent it. And that's completely transformed now. We can WhatsApp immediately, and there's face contact as well as voice contact. So I don't think we should underestimate the power of the audio-visual. And we all know from the last few months that having a teleconference or a phone call is not the same as having some sort of Zoom engagement or whatever system you're using, because you can read cues. But it's also limited. That isn't as powerful as being present with people in a room or in a particular community. So if I go back to the main point around immersion, Vincent in the chat makes a good point. He talks about the benefits of international volunteering accrue primarily to the volunteer. I both agree and disagree with that. I agree with the sense that it's very much in line with this idea of being open to being transformed and to engage in that immersion experience in a way that is humble, but not in a way that it's about me taking the benefits. I remember one of the most disempowering conversations I had during my time in Pakistan was with two lads who we were using the whole Delta training for transformation approach to try and, as a means of, social analysis, to try and unpack issues. We were chatting about it in the evening, and the two lads were on a little bit of swad under the tongue, so they were feeling pretty relaxed and disinhibited. And one of them said, well, it's grand for you. You'll be here for 2 or 3 years and you'll get lots of benefits, and you'll go home and that will continue to benefit you, but we'll be still stuck here. And there's a lot of truth in that. And it was disempowering because there was I with my enthusiasm in my late 20s, hoping I could make some sort of a contribution to making this world a better place for all of us. And they were feeling this is not going to change. Poverty means I die in my 40s. Poverty means if my children get sick, I don't have very many options. Poverty means if someone in the household gets sick, the kids need to be taken out of school and we struggle to pay the rent, and you know, there are huge impacts there. Where I disagree with Vincent is that it depends on the type of volunteering we're facilitating. That was an experience that was created by the Columban Lay Mission Programme, which wasn't about doing. So maybe it's a little bit different to what Colette was talking about, and there's a huge value in that. But there wasn't a particular piece of work that needed to be done. It was about facilitating an exchange, and indeed their international program was about, you know, Chilean volunteers coming to the UK volunteers going to the Philippines, Filipinos coming to Ireland, Irish volunteers going to Pakistan. So it was about that global kind of international perspective and sharing. And I would suggest that that kind of an immersive experience transforms you, and it changes the way in which you engage in everything thereafter, the way in which you live your life, the kind of choices you make, because it's not about giving back. So we shouldn't look at volunteering as giving back. I'm not comfortable with the phrase giving back because it suggests we've taken something that we shouldn't have taken and now we're giving it back. I think before you get to the point where you're in a position to give back, you need to make choices that recognize that the way in which I live my life has an impact on other people in this world. But if that's the kind of transformation we want to create, then I think an immersive volunteering experience is one powerful way of doing that. That's not to say there can't be other components in it, but maybe that's something that, again, Colette was talking about, looking at other options or doing things differently. Online and that kind of those relationships that can be built online is certainly one way of doing that. But I think you can't underestimate the power of immersion. And when you talk about understanding local community or local dynamics, the original question, obviously, as Victor said, local knowledge is key. But there are other perspectives. Sometimes you can come in, and we all know in organizations in which we work, somebody new joins the team, and all of a sudden they start asking questions that we had long since forgotten, and that sometimes that can open up new ways. So there is a value in both. It's both and rather than either or. But I'm not sure if I've answered your question, Shane, or just created another one. But it's about immersion and relationships, I think, and the power of those relationships.
What I do want to, because I'm very conscious of the time, it's so pressurized on the online environment. Seamus, again, I am going to come to you because it came up several times in terms of the donor and the donor responsibility around this because of the affordability aspect for the Global South in particular to play their part. You know, is it realistic, I suppose, that the donors might, you know, I know you're putting on your donor hat now as opposed to your previous volunteer experience. Is it realistic that the donors might come to the party with something like this? I mean, what is the incentive for Irish donors to engage if they're not sending, you know, putting bums on seats, if they're not sending Irish volunteers or whatever? There is a shifting of you know, of the divide between the traditional understanding of men and women leaving the shores to go and support their fellow missionaries, as it were, back in the day. You know, that's all that dynamic is changing. So I suppose I'm just asking for, what do you think would the buy-in be from the donors?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, and I don't think donors are an homogenous group either. You'll get lots of variety and different perspectives. I would hope, and Sarah made this point earlier, that it's about more than lip service, and yes, the terminology has changed over time, and I would hope that there is a value placed on participation, and there's a value placed on people being involved in their own, in decisions that influence their own life trajectories, their own personal, family and community and nation's development. But I think it'll vary. I think one challenge we have with in the current environment with kind of donor concern around the support for what they're doing, they need to be able to show some sort of evidence that, you know, if, for example, the public is donating to us or the taxpayer is donating to us, that it is having an impact. And it's very difficult to measure real impact. And the story moves on. So you end up counting beans, you end up counting what you can count, but not everything that matters can be counted. So there's that whole dilemma. Count what you can to keep people on board, but can you find a way then to support change that takes a generation, change that is much more subtle than that? And I think that's the challenge that we're all in. So to circle right back around, I think there is a real value in having people involved in making decisions in those donor agencies that have that flavor or that experience from whether it's from volunteering or from engaging in different ways, that recognize there are nuances to this. And it's not just something that you've studied and you have your nice log frame and numbers that go across the columns and boxes are ticked.
Sure.
Again, it's a both and, there's a value in both, but I think if you haven't experienced those multiple perspectives, it's very difficult. If all you have is a hammer, then every problem is a nail. So I don't think we should underestimate the value that volunteer sending agencies or volunteering opportunities can give people, just to open up other windows in their thinking, no matter how short or how varied those opportunities are.
Thanks, Seamus. I'm very conscious. I think we've gone into overtime. I would just like to thank you all sincerely, Sarah in particular, for putting in the work. Apologies again for the breakdown in communications. For whatever reason, we all crashed. I'd like to thank Seamus and Colette and Rhea and Victor coming in from Nairobi today. And I'm going to just finish on a recording that we put together to celebrate our 60th anniversary. This is our 60th year in VC. So we've been a long time in the game, and this is just to give us a little break between sessions. We'll be joining again at what time, Conrad?
Yes. Thanks for that, Shane. So we'll be back at 1 o'clock, so a 45-minute break, and we'll kick off then with the next session, session 3. So thank you very much.
kirata wen ish kirata wen kirata wen ish Batista majalisa se kirata wen watch Batista majalisa se kirata wen Bigone chaka chaka se kirata wen Bebeta marope au se kirata wen kirata wen ish au se kirata wen Batista majalisa se kirata wen